wanted to briefly introduce my two co-discussants, Meredith Bostwick-Lorenzo, who's from an architect at Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, and then Henry Myerberg, who is with and also the founder of HMA2. And then I'm Felix Kronenberg. I'm the faculty and administrator component of the discussion here. So I'm not an architect and know very little about architecture, but a lot about learning spaces. So I work both with digital and physical learning spaces. So and the three of us are going to talk about Agora, and we have a few slides, just a few images that we each thought we would select that kind of frame the discussion for all of us. I'll share my screen here. And we'll start with Meredith. Okay, hope everyone can see that. And when we prepared for this, we talked a lot about that Agora. There's the different scales. It really works at a macro and a micro level and anything in between. And so, Meredith, do you want to explain the images a little bit and the kind of different scales that we might envision and look at?
Sure, Felix, thank you. And we thought it would be interesting to discuss and question today, what are the possibilities of Agora, thinking outside of the kind of classic four walls of a learning space, given that the space of the Agora isn't limited by those four walls, right? So, thinking about even taking the space of learning outside of the campus proper, and figuring out and inviting in the city, the context, the community, possibilities that are even beyond the campus proper itself as a part of the Agora. And I think, Henry, you're going to talk a little bit about the classical definition of Agora and how that started to spawn some of our thinking around this. So, Felix, to your point, just to talk through these scales, which is very interesting. Also, the scales looking to the context in which we're speaking about Agora. And so in this particular example, our work with James Corner Field Operations, as well as Cornell Tech, where Cornell Tech embraced the notion of an open campus, a campus with no gates, no walls, no classical kind of definition of this is the campus, you have arrived to a campus. Instead, the notion was a river-to-river experience, completely connected and coherent with its community of Roosevelt Island in New York City, and inviting the community in to be partners. And then the next scale of that is essentially looking at a campus level, or the places in between buildings, recognizing that not all of the programs of what we want to do need to necessarily reside within the buildings or the classic four walls of a learning space itself, but all of these programs can bleed out into the landscape and actually stitch buildings, users, constituents together. And I think that's a little bit of what we're talking about as an Agora at the campus level. So here in the image on the right, you see some of the cafe spilling outdoors. You see a picnic table, which is used from anything from lunches to board meetings outside, and some classic kind of stepped areas, as well as gaming and large plaza spaces. And the notion here was to get academic partnerships, as well as industry partners, students, faculty, people who are coming to a hotel and executive center, to cross-pollinate and move across the Agora from one place to another. So another thing that Felix and Henry and I have been talking about is how movement is important in this space, how that plays in the space of the Agora. Next slide, Felix. So jumping to a more intimate scale, looking at the building level and at a personal level. The building level, something that Jeannie and I have been speaking about over the past few years, is this notion of permeability, and how permeability is important to the space of the Agora, and how you access the Agora, and how the Agora leads you to other spaces. This is a project that we just completed at Barnard College's campus. So, it's a very how would you say, high density urban environment for a campus proper, but we really found ways to allow the library itself at every level to have this permeability to the outdoors, and the sense that it is fully connected both visually and physically to this sense of Agora, which is the central campus lawn. And so the library kind of permeability and connectivity to that at a building scale was very important in that sense of Agora. And then jumping scales there, just inside of one of those terraces, are the picture of the green chairs on the right, which Jeannie and I speak to quite a lot. Students on campus, before the pandemic, always started to say, let's meet at the green chairs, not let's meet at the library, let's meet at the green chairs. And that notion, that sense of belonging, that sense of more personalized space, a space where students can be drawn to and captured, in this space of the Agora, in a sense, as opposed to having that sense of comfort only in their dorm room or place of residence, is also something that I think, Felix and Henry, we've talked about how, architects sometimes tend to create spaces that are so perfect that they're not hospitable or inviting or welcoming to the larger community. And I think that the notion here is about how do we afford the spaces to be spaces of belonging, that people want to be in and feel that they have agency in terms of articulating that space to what their particular needs are. So with that, Felix, I toss it back to you.
Oops, sorry, I went a little too fast here. Thank you so much. And I'll just talk to Henry maybe next. Maybe Henry, you said you've gotten really interested since last week when we had our discussions and even went back in history. Obviously, the concept of Agora is a really old one and has been with us for a very long time. Do you want to maybe speak about the ancient Agora a little bit to us? And
I can, or I could say this is a rendering of a new project we're doing, but in fact, it's no, just Raphael's painting, School of Athens. And anyway, what fascinated me about this word, I just wanted to understand a little bit better. Agora, that it's just a place where people would meet, and I think about the Athenian model that I kind of read about, and where people meet is where learning happens. I mean, it's almost, it's not, it's as simple as that. But I thought the other notion is that in ancient Greece, this was a place where physicians and artists and philosophers and merchants and artists would meet. So it is anybody from any walk of life, and there was a sense of welcome. And this was sort of at the sort of core of the ancient Greek vision of democracy, and this idea of a place of free exchange of ideas and people from multiple backgrounds and disciplines, and even Plato's philosophy around that idea of differences, like discovering differences in people is what's important, and then that's how you understand respect and the density of that. And I was like, wow, how did I miss all this the last 2,000 years? And it seemed like a really interesting and timeless and relevant model about thinking of learning spaces today and breaking down the barriers between people, breaking down the barriers between spaces, and breaking down the barriers between disciplines. And this seems to be, so much of what learning wants to be more and more about, and thinking about the richness and the sort of relevance of liberal arts education is about enabling people to find their voice amongst diversity. And so how relevant is that today? So just on the next slide, and taking that same idea and thinking about, well, this was a new university we did, American University of Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And here was the campus, and I think it was really interesting how Meredith talked about the scalability Agora, and here it was, the whole the building, the campus was a campus in a box. And in the center was this kind of a 3D browsing space. And the idea that the welcoming was a sense of coming and arriving to a place where you can see what else is going on. And that says something like the seeing of what's going on is the invitation to participate. And that seemed to be very much what the Greek model was about. And so I think this is just a timeless aspect. And so this is not about innovation. This is just about tapping into what's sort of innate and timeless. And I think Meredith uses a great word, fundamental, what the fundamentals are. Space is like, well, how do you get people to see each other and hang out with each other and have those both planned and chance encounters? And this space is a space to allow that. So it's also a place for events, but it's also a place to hang out every day and to see what's going on. And the classrooms are along the perimeter. And then the interior is the sort of loungy space and study spaces. And the library is at the core of this too. Also, another aspect about libraries placed on the campus, and you go up this top of these steps and you arrive at the library, which is sort of like the ancient version or the sort of traditional version of library as well. And so kind of on the next slide is, after we've done this, we kind of took this idea from something we did in Central Asia to here in Connecticut and the Westport Library. And the idea, that's vision on the right and the left, is the same sort of central reading and multi-purpose room. So it's a reading room during the day and a study and workspace with conference rooms around it. But at night or at any time, it's whatever anybody wants it to be. And I think this is what Meredith was alluding to and mentioning, is about how to avoid programming space like, oh, this is the function of this space. No, the function of this space is for you to figure out its function. And this idea of sense of ownership. I love the notion of meet me at the green chairs, in the sense that the students felt like it was theirs because they could twist it around and move it around. And so that same notion about this idea of flexibility is one which a space that's more flexible is actually an invitation, not just to use it in different ways, but to feel like it's yours. And the more and more we make people feel like it's yours, that's a good thing. And then the visibility is the invitation to participate. And be part of something, and that sense of belonging, that Meredith talked about. And this all kind of relates to connectivity. And so, connectivity has all been like, here we are called connecting, via Zoom here. And those lessons we're trying to learn from the digital world, we're trying to apply into the physical world, at the same time. So, cheers to Agora, and let's keep, we just want to hear your thoughts and examples and notions around that idea. Thank you.
So when I thought about my images, I thought of a lot of different projects, etc. But I did want to go back in terms of scale to the small scale of the room again and see, that's where a lot of things are still happening. And I really wanted to go back into the disciplines too. Usually when we think about public open spaces and even learning spaces, a lot of the cool projects, they're always discipline unspecific spaces. So libraries, campuses, the quad, all of these kinds of things, the student center. But from the faculty and director perspective, we're in our disciplinary spaces all the time. And part of the problem is that we just don't get out, and we talk about this quite a bit. And so I think the sense of ownership is absolutely crucial that Henry was just mentioning. So I wanted to show something from my previous college, where I was 9 years at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And as an academic, I have to at least read one quote. Bear with me. This is from the 80s, so this is really old, but I think it's been a guiding principle for me. Architecture is an instrument that can encourage or block human behaviors, all the more powerful because its language is addressed to the unconscious. This is the important part. If it is designed entirely by specialists, if it's fixed and untouchable, it cannot possibly respond to the diversity and creativity of those who use it. And I really want to say that the stakeholders, and we'll be talking today a lot about the different stakeholders, need to be a part of this, and not just in the initial design, but spaces evolve, right? We know this. And I think one thing that for someone who's in academia, we live with these spaces, they in and out for decades. And often if you design them, you often design them and then you go on to the next project. So I think there's a different perspective. And so I think it's absolutely crucial to involve the people who use the space every day, because they'll they'll do stuff with the spaces or avoid them if they can change it to their specific needs. And so I wanted to talk about this particular image here, which is the designers at first wanted to create this. This is a language center as a kind of computer lab, and they wanted to make everything look great. Henry already talked about this, and Meredith, you know, trying to make it all really shiny and looking great. And so I fought tooth and nail to not have cable wiring, any of that. It could be even a little messier. And we took this photo and then we started moving stuff around. So instead of bolting things down, to involve the user. And I'll show you how within 9 years the space evolved, right? And hopefully that's interesting for you to see. I don't know how often you get to see the projects you worked on and how they look 5, 10, 20 years later. So here's just a couple of snapshots of these images of what everything that has happened. So this was planned as a computer lab. It turned into a computer lab, a classroom, a meeting space for department meetings, a lecture hall for public lectures, for private lectures. It became a project room. It became a grading room post-semester for the faculty. It became a commons room. It became a lunch room. It became a dinner room. It became a workshop room, a professional development room. Tons of different things that changed throughout the time. So Meredith mentioned this already, and Henry did too, is, you know, if we design something for one purpose, then we're losing a lot of hours in this. And I wanted to show you my favorite, and that's the last slide, what happened actually. And this all came from the users. That didn't come from the designers. That didn't come from me as the director of the space. This came mostly from the students and the faculty. And part of that was inviting them of saying, this is your space and you can curate this space. I think this is a really important notion, is that spaces just can't be. You need to actively curate them. And so here are some examples. So at the top left, you'll see that we kind of started taking out computers as students started bringing more and more of their own devices. We changed the furniture around quite a lot. Then to the top right, you'll see this is when we had the Day of the Dead. We turned this into a giant food space and invited campus. And we had a lot of those events where people who would never set foot in the language corridor would come and mingle. And you see it was extremely full. We started doing yoga in different languages, not my idea for sure. And so we just moved the computers out. And there you see these were events that were not for credit. When do you get students to come to a learning session not for credit? They do, as you see. And so this evolved with other people's things in mind. And I really loved the idea of, think about the first image of computers being in there. Now they're yoga mats. And it just completely changed. And then on the right side, you see students and faculty made this into a maker space, not a design maker space by professional designers to make. They made their own maker space, and they created books out of recycled materials, and then created a little exhibit and invited the community, and then read the books in Spanish to the community. And so you see almost like an ecosystem here of things that can happen in a relatively simple space that was actually under-designed. And I know that that can be really tricky. There's a tendency to over-design spaces, but the more over-designed it is, the less the users can then do stuff with it. So actually doing less can be much more here. And so that, as I thought back of, wow, what do I miss in like the virtual spaces? What, you know, these are the kinds of things where people came together that were extremely powerful. So that is kind of from a disciplinary perspective. This might look very different if you're in physics or religious studies, but this is from the languages. So, and I wanted to send a question back to Henry and Meredith. One of the questions was about who are the new stakeholders? And I mentioned a few. Maybe you can think about from your perspectives, who are the stakeholders and who are the new stakeholders maybe?
I can start at that, Felix. And I think it'll also be an interesting question for the group to think about. But now that we're thinking about spaces beyond the four walls of traditional or conventional learning space, thinking about who else needs to be engaged in the curation of the planning and the design and the thinking behind what these spaces should afford its users to do, knowing that the ultimate program may continue to be defined even after the space itself is constructed. Hopefully, I think that is a goal that we all have as architects, that a space can be used flexibly over time. And Henry, to your point, getting the fundamentals right, but then allowing things to evolve and take shape. But going back to your question about the stakeholders, one example comes to mind. We just recently worked with Wellesley College, where their scientific curriculum said, let's take learning outdoors. Not all of our program has to happen inside. And I think that also connects back to this notion of Agora, but also thinking about what other stakeholders, what other constituents do we need to be able to plan for learning spaces that unconventionally go outdoors, right? And specifically now that we're talking about learning spaces in the setting of pandemics, for those climates that can afford it, right? Yes, it gets quite cold in Boston, but Wellesley valued, its natural environment for learning opportunities, be it through working landscapes, experimental gardens, collecting data through field research or data gathering in ecological settings. To say the least, that Wellesley's campus is a Frederick Law Olmsted designed campus in and of itself. So landscape is very important. But going back to your original question, who are the stakeholders? We had to invite staff and maintenance and operations constituents to the table in order to understand how not only we know what faculty want to do in the landscapes, but how do we make that possible through the curation and the maintenance, the ongoing maintenance and operations of the landscapes, and what's really possible through its natural environment. So that I think is, if it's helpful, that's a specific example of where unconventional stakeholders would be brought to the table to think about the planning of the Agora and its ultimate implementation. Because let's not forget that the actual construction of these spaces can be a learning experience. And so that at Wellesley for us was like an aha moment, because all of a sudden faculty and students said, no, we don't want your classic contractor to construct some of these ecological environments for us. We want our students and our faculty to be engaged in the construction of those environments. So very, very different than, unconventional ways of approaching how you might curate a space for the Agora, and also, its design and construction as a learning opportunity as well. Henry, pass it to you.
Mute.
Anyway, Meredith, that was great. And and also this is part of growing out of our discussion just, yesterday, and thinking about the community of liberal arts colleges or community of higher educational institutions. And traditionally, there's this description, I think it was the former President Pomona described a liberal arts college as a place which was both a cloister and a crossroads. And I think the in-between is the Agora. And the meaning is that in the Athenian version, anybody was welcome. So you didn't have to pay to show up. And that's pretty much, 'cause a lot of our experience doing in public libraries, and it's been informative about thinking about, academic places. And so when we were doing the project in Central Asia and created this facility with an intent and a notion that the sort of Agora of itself was something that the community of the city could use, and that people discovered that. And they were hungry for it, because in the post-Soviet world, there weren't places of free exchange that were been built in any particular recent era. And so the idea of enabling and inviting the community, not to say, oh, you can hold this kind of event, and saying like, oh, how would you like to use this? And what can we do to accommodate that? And as public libraries are doing more and more of that, that seems to be something that's, I think, more an opportunity for colleges, and there's sort of the town gown relationship. And actually, we're just having a recent conversation with Bard College and renovating, expanding their library, and presently their library is actually open to their community, and they have regular people from the community who come in that like to read the newspaper or bring their kids in because it's an activity. And so this idea of the Agora of the university and the college as something that is a community resource, and not in a prescribed way, in an open way. In other words, how do you think you would like to use this? And that's the stakeholder. And whether that stakeholder is involved in the planning, or all those people, the answer is yes, in this sort of idea of being prepared for them.
So one thing, that I was struck by is that, when we have a mental image of Agora, different things come to mind, right? It immediately became clear that we all thought about very different spaces. And it seemed like that one thing is that those are spaces of meaning, right? So that there's something that people immediately like think about compared to maybe more generic, like learning spaces. One question that I had was, in a world in higher ed where we measure almost everything, right? Like data is everything, like how many classes are used, how many seats, how many percentages do we do X and Y, etc. Does the notion of Agora defy that? How do we measure that it's a successful space? And I know we're thinking about this for learning spaces in general. It might be easier to just take a classroom because it's a box. We can measure certain things. How often is it used? What's the temperature? All of that. But it seems like these different notions of Agora are almost immeasurable. Have you encountered that? What would somebody, if you talk to an administrator and they say, well, how do I know this is successful? How do I know that is a successful space? It seems to be a gut feeling, right? Like the space is used, or people are there. It's full of life, but they seem to be very hard to measure. Is that something that you hear a lot when you work with administrations these days, that they want to have things measured? And
I can.
Is this for the group?
Is this for the group? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
yeah.
for the group. Yeah.
One of the benefits that we found working with academic libraries, excuse me, hold on, is it's a group of people who love to collect and analyze data. And when we were working with the folks at Grand Valley State University on their new library, even before it was finished, they already had plans in place for how they were going to track users throughout essentially a super flexible space. So using technology, I mean, aside from having student staff go through every couple hours and do a head count, they actually used Wi-Fi heat mapping. They looked at how the different technology outlets were being used throughout the day. But it's something that they still do just to understand how different spaces are being used, and kind of treating the whole building like a big experiment. And when something is a little dead or slow, they change it up and measure how it works. So yeah, I think using the resources that higher education already has, especially talking to the library data folks, that's where I'd start.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question I had was, this originally came when we started writing this essay probably a year ago, or a little less than a year ago, looking at technology and can the virtual spaces recreate the sense of Agora? And I'm really curious to see if anyone has any thoughts on that. If you think we can do this, and what it might look in the virtual world, or how this would look in kind of a hybrid space, and how we might combine and overlap digital and physical spaces, and maybe how they can transition into each other. Have you encountered any type of Agora in the virtual world during these past months, especially during the lockdown time? Has anyone seen any good examples, or is this something that is just completely lost and just very traditional dedicated classes as learning experiences? And this is for everyone, if anyone wants to speak. Yeah, Meredith.
Felix, I would share an example of our Barnard project that we looked at earlier, which was designed as a teaching and learning center plus library, I guess you could say, a library of the future, but as a teaching and learning center. And because, as you said, you know, looking to the library staff who really deep in the data and analyzing things, because we took we kind of rode the wave of them telling us we want to create a series of centers that would be focused in ways of doing. And so we have a center for post and pre-production. We have a center for empirical reasoning. We have a center for digital humanities. We have a center for design and making. We have a center for computational science. And we have a center for engaged pedagogy. And so what's interesting, you know, going back to March of last year, which we talk about all the time, you know, pandemic hits and we all flipped to remote, or at least a lot of us did. And it was a very difficult time for campus administrators to really be able to make that pivot. What was interesting is that our teaching and learning center, which was, you know, literally every seat is occupied, you know, every hour of the day, flipped from being a physical space of teaching and learning to a place where small cohorts or instructors could actually go and engage in each of these centers and actually record and flip their content and put it online. You know, be it digital humanities or record a professor who wants to record a seminar and then put it up online. And so what's interesting for us, and there's a great article, I'm happy to share it with others, that Barnard has written about the resilience of resiliency of the Teaching and Learning Center as a place to help them curate, I guess you could say, an agora of online content during the pandemic. Has the Teaching and Learning Center and its centers have enabled faculty to get in there and do those things in a very personalized way and a responsible way, given the ongoing pandemic. And Barnard essentially had, you know, their students operating in a remote environment. But it is an example, and I'd be happy to share the article that they dive deep into how they did that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also think, just picking up what Meredith is saying, and also Patrick, I think this sort of how you do this measuring and the technology, and Felix, you're right that, you know, they're you know, more and more it's like the metrics drive the decision making and aspect, and it's, you know, I consider that to be, you know, it's a blessing and a curse at the same time so often. But a very simple measure is, you know, we experience, and not because we're in the measuring business at all, but like, well, how many more people showing up on a regular basis?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and particularly in libraries, they do the head count and stuff like, and also can tell how long people stayed there and whatnot, but also just for events and programming. Because thinking about, you know, libraries are becoming, you know, have always been sort of the sort of mini university version anyway. And so very much about, and becoming more and more about programming activities within it. And so the measure a lot of times was just how many people are actually, you know, showing up. And then the other measure, you know, let's say, you know, American University of Central Asia, the other measure was, well, how many more students were applying to the university? And so opening the facility, because it had been around by 20 years and rented place, blah, blah. Anyway, you know, they attracted, you know, twice as many students, you know, so that was their measure. So I think the measuring, at least trouble I have measuring, this is like a conceptual question, everybody, is the one measure formula does not fit all. It has to be specific to the culture and the institution or the place where it is. And I'm interested in learning more about that. I know Jeannie's trying to figure that, you know, we're trying to figure this whole measuring business model something. So I'd love to hear from other folks here. And you know, Susan, you did that great article. You were measuring, you know, output, you know, in the teaching and learning spaces to some extent, right? I mean, there was some measuring going on.
Yeah. In the Georgia Tech study, it was, you know, a lot of in-depth research with using digital ethnographic software and things like that. What I came away learning from that experience and others is, and I've talked about this for a number of years, I think the smarter our buildings get, that what we found at Georgia Tech Clough Commons was that even with all of the great wayfinding that was in the building, some students, because I watched this, I was part of the observation team, some students would come out of class and they would only have 15 or 20 minutes to sit down and be productive. And it took them 10 minutes to find a seat, to do that. So it was sort of a waste of time for them. But as our buildings get smarter, I've always said that if we were able to, have some kind of sensors, at particular workspaces, then, and that were accessible to the students on their personal devices. So it's sort of like having access to a digital dashboard. You could actually use that for two purposes. One, measure, instead of doing bed checks, you've got the digital information there, but also it's an inclusive, it provides more inclusivity, because many of those students who are struggling to do that feel like they're wasting time and they don't belong, and may be overwhelmed sensory-wise, and they depend a lot on getting information through their mobile devices. So to me, it actually served two purposes. And if you're measuring how long those students will sit there instead of walking around looking for a space, those were the kinds of things that we were really interested in. So,
thank you. Eve, you had your hand up.
Hi. So I have a response both to Felix's your prompt and then Meredith's example about measurement, as well as kind of more inspired that's from Meredith's example of the library, of manifesting ideas and values, which that library is a great example of. The library and the centers, as Meredith knows, my daughter's going to be a senior at Barnard, and so starting the fall of 2020, she got a job as being a fellow at the Empirical Reasoning Center. So it's like a student program that they work in these centers. And
That's great.
So she held online office hours, right? So that center, which was created as a very thorough part of the research for creating that library, existed online because it was manifested as a building.
Exactly.
So I just think that's
it's
really
very meta.
it's like a very, like, the value that the college and the community expressed by saying this is so important to us, we're going to give it space in the building, then had the time to exist like online before everything closed. But let's just say things closed a year earlier or 2 years earlier when the building had maybe just opened. Whatever it is, like the value of it existing and getting physical space, like, was really deep and important, and then carried over into the virtual. So I think that is just a great example, Meredith, that you can say this was part of the process and now it exists. And I can say my daughter got to be a student who learned, like, they trained her to do that too.
That's incredible.
So it exists now virtually, but also, like, it goes to the measuring, like, that we're not, and I think folks have said, like, well, yeah, we could be measuring body count or how long people stay, but we don't know what the value or the meaning is all the time. And I mean, Susan, your example of collecting the ethnographic data at the same time is great. But that's a little bit I don't know, there's like the pre-work, Meredith. So you're talking about having done a lot of pre-work and maybe Susan, it sounds like you're including some post-occupancy work too, but like, how do you know what it is that you're trying to manifest or what the values and ideas are? I think that's maybe like where those two, we don't always have that opportunity. And librarians,
Yes, exactly.
are such great, like, you know, torchbearers for this, because they often do have an idea. Sometimes it's just body count because they want to know that, but often they do have an idea. Like, are they doing, you know, do they have a question? Are they seeking reference help? Like, right, they have personas that they sometimes track, like what the behavior patterns are. But anyway, I kind of wanted to put that out there about not forgetting to have the idea or the values included in what the measurement.
And having the champions, you know, because it's not only the library and the library staff, but it's also in the curation and the creation of these centers. Yes, the library is a perfect place for all of this kind of access to knowledge and ways of doing and help, service, all of these things. But the library in terms of its staff can't do it alone. Because a lot of you know, honed expertise in what you're trying to not teach students, but enable them to do, you know, be it online, be it through empirical reasoning, be it through like the digital humanities that we have at Barnard, and production and making. I mean, that is a large range of people, you know. Karen Fairbanks, for example, she's the director of the Department of Architecture, but she is the champion for the making studio, right? It's not a librarian. You know, they've engaged someone from another department to be with the library, at the library with these centers, but a core, like a knowledge expertise. So Jeannie, back to that question of who should be engaged. When we're thinking about creating a cluster of centers, let's say at the library in a new form, Felix, of Agora, let's say, it really is about tapping the expertise, be they from science, you know, in terms of computer science and big data, or be it from the School of Architecture and art in terms of making, tapping that expertise and inviting them to not only to the table to plan and design, but in the ultimate curation of what you are providing as a service, if that makes sense, to students and faculty within the Agora.
And I think one thing we started with scale, I wanted to talk to, because I personally, you know, moved from a very small private liberal arts college to a large research university. And I think it really depends on the type of institution. Absolutely, Eve, what you were saying is that, you know, values and mission and vision and priorities are absolute key, and always going back to how does your physical space reinforce that. And what I'm seeing is that, you know, at a bigger school, people are trying to not be on campus because, you know, for what you need to do, often it's beneficial if you don't run into people. And, you know, if you do your narrow research, that can be for many positions at a large school be beneficial. Whereas at a smaller, maybe a liberal arts college, there's real value of going back and being on campus. And also it's a different educational ideal. And I think that's something we need to think about, the different missions that the universities have. If you're a commuter campus, the notion of Agora is something very different probably than if you have 18-year-olds who live day in, day out together on a small campus, right? And so I think that is there isn't a one size fits all approach to this, right? And so I think the exciting thing might be looking post-pandemic is if these institutions are going to differentiate themselves and go in different directions, because that's what I can see already. And I think in the design, it'll be really interesting to see, because I'm already seeing our offices at the big university as being ghost towns anyways. And now that'll be even more so if most people, you know, only come about 2 days a week on campus. And we actually did surveys, and most people want to come about 2 to 3 days. That's kind of what people want to do on campus. So how do we design something around that when you're on campus, you can maximize the social aspect of running into people, that you're not just in your office. So that's going to be quite interesting. Yeah. There was somebody had a hand up. Patrick, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, real quick, our company did a survey throughout all of our offices, and that's the same answer we got. It was about a 3-day. That's kind of the average.
Yeah.
My family and my dog are like, no, 5 days, go, be gone. But just a couple things that came out of this conversation, I just wanted to touch on. When I was looking at the phrase phygital, when you research that, it comes up under the retail experience a whole lot more than anywhere else, which kind of again comes back to the idea of the Agora as a marketplace. And I think I liked the idea that if you're important enough to have a space, then you're important enough to be invested, to have investment into going, into the digital realm as well. But I think like the retailers that have been able to survive this are the ones that are looking at how do you provide that physical experience along with the convenience that the digital brings, and how do we do that without saying on a university campus you got to be like retail, because that it never lands well. One of the things from an Agora, and as a parent of a teenager, they like going to the marketplace at a different time of day than I do, and when they get there, it's a very different experience. And that's something we've learned quickly on a couple of the library projects, is that there's a time shift, use shift issue, that how the building is used during the middle of the day is very different than how it's used in the evening. And I think for either interior or exterior space, that's something we have to take into account, is a dramatic use change day to night. Some spaces we've seen dead quiet during the day, and at night they actually curate the space by bringing in a jazz band that plays for several hours in the evening once in a while. Another observation real quick is when you think about different user groups to engage, in addition to facilities and maintenance, campus security, campus police, if you're talking about a highly flexible multi-use space, they tend to get uptight about that. And if they are engaged at the beginning, and you're talking about CEPTED principles, you're talking about biophilic principles, and you bring them into that conversation early, we found that mitigates a lot of, well, you got to have it locked down this and key cards only and nobody from the outside. So that's a huge group that's got to be part of the conversation right at the get-go.
I was interested in the topic about involving campus security and about how open and welcoming these places are. And certainly one of the trends we've seen has been an increase in transparency. And on almost every project today, somebody will comment, usually a faculty member, what happens if a bad person comes in? Where do we hide? How do we lock down? All of those kind of things. And I've heard everything from there shouldn't be any windows to campus police saying, I'd like it if the whole building were glass so we can see where the bad person is and find them and take care of it. So the question, I think, is how much transparency is enough? How much is too much? And how do you deal with these sort of security issues, which unfortunately we hear all too often are very legitimate concerns? So it's I think a matter of, how open can a building be and what kind of spaces are there that gives students and others a choice about where they want to hang out, where they want to mingle with their friends and colleagues. I'm a lab planner, so I tend to focus on laboratory type spaces, but I also talk about the whole building as a learning opportunity, and the importance of those soft spaces as kind of the glue that forms the heart and soul of a building, where you might keep those students in the building after they leave their lab or class, and continue the learning process from each other, peer learning. So I just throw that out there for consumption or comment or retort.
I think it's super important that students feel safe. I think the kind of safety aspect is important, and I think that's part of belonging. And if you look at one of the recent NESI, which is the National Undergraduate Engagement Survey, they have as a high impact practice is a sense of belonging for all. And I think the for all piece is important here, is how do we're increasingly at our university looking at how do we create spaces of belonging where everyone feels safe, right? And so there's certainly certain spaces where I, as a white male can go and feel like, hey, I'm great, right? And others would perceive this very differently. And there was a project here where they actually had a heat map of where students felt safe on campus. And I think that's really important to consider this, is that kind of safety too. I think the other one, as you mentioned, is important as well. And if you're curious to look at more, I'm working with a PhD student in architecture who is researching active shooter prevention. So it's a pretty dark topic, though, I have to say, being on that committee, but it's fascinating of what they look at. And some of that is if you make it too tight, then also the users feel constantly, something might happen. You also want to avoid that, right? And so I think there's work going on, but I don't have any other details about it. But I think this kind of looking for everyone, and where people feel, we've had it now with international students, with Asian American students, etc., who, where do they go on campus? And are we really providing the spaces that they feel they should go there? And part of that was, do they even go to faculty offices? We know that certain groups go less because they're intimidated by faculty, right? Going into a dedicated office area. So I think there's a lot that we need to do in that area.
And I think what you're saying, Felix, there's a sweet spot here, and we're not going to figure it out on this, on this call, or even necessarily in our lifetimes. But between creating a place everyone feels welcome, but then some places where you want to be welcome with people that you have a connection with. Sometimes you want to be part of the of the crowd. And I think the only thing we're trying to keep doing, and I'm sure Meredith's in the same motion here, we're trying to create spaces where you present choice. And so it's not just one thing, one size fits all, or one experience. It's really the variety is the spice of life in architecture. And and you can't define it. God knows, I don't know how to measure it, results of it.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, the policing, the safety, the security, these are all things that are in discussion now, also in terms of equity on the campus. And, the desire not to feel that you're being watched also, that you're not in a panopticon space and you're being monitored all the time in your activities, because certainly if you feel that, you're not going to feel welcome there. But also back to the connection to the Agora, there's also something that we should be thinking about too, which is Agora potentially is the place for students to demonstrate or to carry out, look, I'll say it, student protest. Also something that we've seen in the past year of this pandemic is, the crisis of equity and justice. And so the space of the Agora needs to be a place where those types of activities occur and are allowed to occur on campus to enable students to raise their voice. So, balancing that with the whole equation of safety and security, and quite honestly, safety and security isn't just positioning a camera and recording an activity, but it also includes good design in terms of lighting levels, right? And making people feel safe, and so that things are visible, and also the way things are designed don't lead to a dangerous corner, let's say, or what could be interpreted as a dangerous corner. So lots of things to bear in mind here.
I just wanted to, Safta, you had your hand up.
Yes.
I just wanted to, do you have a question or a comment? Or
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment that if we assess how do you measure success of the notion of an Agora, and the obvious one is it's a venue for people to come together, for anyone to come together, share ideas, and create knowledge. That is the obvious one. But, during SCUP, I was really struck by a statement from one of the speakers that higher education is the new place of human rights and civil rights development. And so if we start measuring the Agora's success as a place for creating inclusion and community, we have to turn upside down our assessment of large groups of people who are all homogenous, measuring the success of an Agora. How does the Agora play a role in creating inclusion, creating a sense of belonging by layering skills that it provides. I think, Felix, you asked the point about the Agora virtually. One of the biggest successes in virtual meeting context has been the success of breakout rooms, where even we as groups are able to contribute more and feel safer contributing to a group of 3 or 4 as opposed to 70 people on the screen. And so the assumption that a large group of people gathering together in an Agora translates into success is really questionable in terms of its impact on inclusivity and bringing in those who are marginalized to be part of the community. So the Agora offers an opportunity to be alone together, right? Where you can see community happening, but you may have a sensory overload issue or neurodiversity, which doesn't allow you to be comfortable in that. You can still see it, but you don't have to be in it. And you can still find a way of bridging, becoming a member of the community. So I think in the post-COVID world of campuses, I really call them refuge and havens of social equity. We need to look at the Agora as an instrument of building inclusivity in new ways and bringing people into the community who don't believe they belong as a measure of success.
Excellent. Yeah, this is
beautiful. That was beautifully said.
Yeah, yeah. I completely agree, and that can happen digitally. We just have, you know, we're not as experienced with that. We don't have thousands of years of experience on how to do it online. But as you were just saying, you know, I've seen students who would never speak up in a physical classroom thrive in an online environment. And I think that kind of looking not at this monolithic block, but really looking at individuals and allowing them to get that access. And, you know, I think it's a measure of student choice, right? Of where do they engage and where do they feel they can be a part of. And I think creating those spaces will be more of a spectrum of physical and virtual. And I mean, one thing, and we don't have time to discuss this, but one thing Henry and Meredith and I talked about is that, you know, maybe the job of architect and, you know, is separate right now from a virtual learning designer. Maybe those are more merging together and their skill sets either as teams, people working together, or it's something where each, you know, in each position, you're learning something from the other. Because I think the complementary notion of having the physical, because, you know, the body is important, right? We shouldn't forget the body and the physical environment, but also the virtual, and that there are aspects that are really inclusive and accessible for students and others that often can't participate. And one thing that I've noticed is in terms of conferences, the conferences have become more international, and they now have more students who usually can't pay, especially graduate students, and they have more contingent faculty who often don't have travel funds. So they have become more diverse. They also, you don't have to fly to these conferences anymore. So people who have, you know, who are caregivers, for example, or who have accessibility issues can participate in conferences that they were excluded before. And I think we can't really discount that. And I think for some organizations, we've seen that a kind of hybrid of offering both and finding new ways to combine the two can be really beneficial there. So